I'm good, enjoying these finals.
Yes, very much so. And, I got to be honest, I thought Cleveland would win the game last night, mainly because they had the extra day. The way they lost, I thought, hey, it was one of those games where you just write it off and say, look, they beat us. We looked like we're done. But I thought LeBron would carry them to that next level with the extra day. So I was disappointed they lost last night. Were you, or did you feel that Game 5 was the end of the series for them? Or Game 4, I should say.
Yeah, no, I thought it would be more competitive, certainly, than Game 4 for some of the reasons you mentioned, the rest and the fact that there was no way they were going to shoot as poorly from three-point range and even outside the paint in general as they did in Game 4. But then when you consider how good the Warriors have been at home all season, it's hard to expect them to ever lose at Oracle. I kind of always felt that we were headed towards a do-or-die Game 6 for the Cavaliers back on their home court to try to extend the series.
Kevin, obviously, the game last night, and I said this in Game 1 and Game 2, they both went to overtime. And we keep saying, look, Cleveland's just shorthanded, they're not good enough, they don't have the depth. But for two games, if you get to overtime for whatever factors come in on those given nights, you were there. You were right there with them. Do you think they just have run out of gas because they had to play like that those first two games just to get the split, and now it's all kind of come catching up to them that they just don't have the talent?
Well, Game 1, they had such a big performance from Kyrie Irving that it certainly was a lot more realistic to do that. And then, you had those two games, Game 2 and Game 3, I think, where the Warriors were out of character in terms of, first off, not getting as many open shots as usual, and then struggling to make them when they did get those opportunities. And we've seen that still in stretches, I think, in Games 4 and 5. But with that shift to the smaller lineup and making this more of a wide-open, freer-flowing series than the half-court slog that it was in the first three games, I think that's really allowed the Warriors to exploit their advantages in terms of depth and in terms of talent.
Kevin Pelton, ESPN.com. Kevin, LeBron, 40 points, 14 rebounds, 11 assists last night. Obviously, you look at that and you say, unbelievable. 15 of 34 from the field. So what's the narrative on him at the end of the night?
I mean, he's having to do so much, really, truly historic amount. That I think, it's understandable that his efficiency hasn't been in there in this series. It's the highest usage rate that a player has had in the finals in terms of the possessions you're finishing with a shot attempt, a trip to the free throw line, or a turnover. Since turnovers started being tracked in 1977, he's just edging out Jordan in the 98 finals. And then when you add in all the assists he's had, it's incredible. He's been involved in 66%, almost two-thirds of the Cavaliers' field goals in this series. Nobody going back to 78, again, has been involved in more than 56%. And some of the other numbers, Seth Partnow of Nylon Calculus has done a good job of studying this. When LeBron isn't involved in setting up his teammates, either off a second chance off one of his misses or, again, one of his passes, they're shooting an effective field goal percentage of about 30%, which is, far worse than the worst shooter in the NBA could possibly manage, and they've done this over 5 full games.
Yeah, I thought last night he played about as well as you could. For what you have, for them to be around that game, you certainly have an opportunity to see something special happening. But in the end, he might not win this series, and it would be, 2 and 4 for him. How would you summarize him at the end of these 6 NBA Finals appearances for him, if in fact they don't come back and win this thing? I think, to me, it is one of the more bizarre sports things that we can come across. The player, because so many times, Kevin, the best player does win. Jordan was 6 for 6, and he won 6 MVPs. Most of the people have, when they get there, they win it, and it's so bizarre that this is the narrative and the story for him.
Well, I think Jordan set an unrealistic standard for anyone who was coming about after him because, since the Russell Celtics, nobody has been that dominant in the finals. Even Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, because they were playing each other, ended up losing, a few of those series along the way. Jordan just was unmatched in terms of, his team's success, and having guys like Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman and Horace Grant was a part of that. Part of what's happened with LeBron is, in 2011, legitimately was his fault. He played really poorly in the finals. That was one of the things I was studying is, Dwayne Wade that year actually was kind of carrying Miami almost as much as LeBron has Cleveland this year because of the fact that LeBron was struggling in that series. But the last 2 years, he's been, terrific, more than good enough, I think, to win, and just the help has not been there last year because of aging and injury, and this year because of injury with Love and Irving being out of the lineup.
Kevin, last night we saw, and we've seen it a couple times now, the Golden State Warriors go small. Last night, 8-2, they get out. Black calls timeout, and then he kind of decides, you know what, I got to do this too. Mozgov, though, has really been kind of the second-best player. Are they going to have to use him and dictate to Golden State the way the game's played, or is Mozgov not going to be an option in Game 6?
I don't know. I mean, we've seen them try it both ways and not have it work either way. And I don't know necessarily what that tells you, but I think we could see a larger role for Timofey Mozgov. Rest Tristan Thompson a little bit more and take advantage of Golden State's backups because they did have Festus Ezeli on the floor for an extended stretch in the second half. Did get a little bit bigger than in the first half when it was entirely David Lee and Draymond Green in the middle. But I think this is probably the way they're going to keep playing going forward. Part of it is, if you've got put more shooting out there on the floor, rely heavily on the three, that does give you a better chance of pulling the upset. Just go for that high variance strategy.
We've got a lot going on in this series, and obviously Steph Curry, who, had nice numbers at the end of the first couple games, but was not Steph Curry that won the MVP. Last night, that was more of him. What will this mean for him if he's able to win this championship and quite possibly be the MVP of the NBA Finals?
I think there's some validation to some of the more shallow criticisms, I guess, that you'll always see of a guy before his team has, the highest success of, he's so frail and so dependent on the three. Can he do it in the playoffs? I mean, no one will ever ask that question about Steph Curry again if the Warriors go on to win this series.
Yeah, and, he's a guy who, I mean, when you look at him, I kind of said he reminds me of like a Steve Nash kind of crossed over with like an Allen Iverson almost. He's so fast, but he shoots the ball so well. But I don't know that you look at those guys like all-time greats. I mean, I think they were great for the time that they were, at the top of their game. But is Curry just, one of these guys that will be at the top of his game for a handful of years? Or do you think he could start building himself into being one of these all-time recognizable greats?
I think he's got that opportunity. We'd probably look at Nash a lot differently if his Suns hadn't run into the Spurs a couple times. Who knows what happens if Amare Stoudemire and Boris Diaw don't get suspended for coming off the bench in that 2007 series, and where San Antonio ended up with an easy path to the championship after beating Phoenix. That was by far their hardest series. But, Curry, what he's able to do in terms of the volume and accuracy he has from three-point range makes him a weapon unlike anything we've ever seen before in NBA history. And, I don't see a scenario where the three starts getting less important in the next couple of years here. It's only going to increase in importance. And I think that continues to make Steph Curry, in the discussion for the best player in the league and on a team that, with its young talent, figures to continue to be in the mix.
So that being said, we're here in Philadelphia, and we're watching what's happening with Joel Embiid, and obviously they have Nerlens Noel, and there's a possibility that they can go with another big man. Is that way of building your team not the way to go about it anymore? Should teams be not looking at the big men anymore and trying to find a way to compile more guards and slashing type of players?
Yeah, I think you can read too much into the results of a single series or two. One of the things that makes the Warriors unique is their ability to win with multiple styles. And, we've seen them play more physical games where Andrew Bogut and Draymond Green in the front court together were a big factor against, a Memphis or a Houston. I think you have to play all those different styles to win the finals. The other aspect of it is, if you start talking about a guy like Kristaps Porzingis, who has been linked a little bit to the Sixers lately, he's not the traditional, interior big man who, would be potentially played off the court in a series like this. He's the kind of guy I think who could thrive in up and down, environment with the floor well spaced.
While you mentioned Porzingis, yes, there is a lot of buzz around here that the Sixers would possibly grab him at the number 3 pick. Would that be, in your mind, too much of a risk?
I think it depends on who's out there, and the likely event that somehow Towns and Russell go number 2. I think then it could certainly be a reasonable outcome for them because Porzingis is a different style of player than they have now in the front court. With Embiid has shown the ability to shoot threes in drills and things like that, but we haven't seen that from him in games. And Dario Saric even probably doesn't project to be the same kind of shooter. He's more of the playmaking forward that Zach Lowe has written about on Grantland when he comes over. So, I think it could be reasonable then. But to me, D'Angelo Russell is the second best player in this draft after Towns, and then also a great fit for what the Sixers are trying to do.
Let me get your thoughts on Embiid. Here, the place is panicking. Everybody's jumping off into. I'm on the Ocean City Boardwalk right now, Kevin, staring at the Atlantic Ocean, and I think people are running into it, worried that this guy might never play. In your mind, is there legitimate concerns when you hear that he is not healing as quickly as they'd hoped?
Yeah, I mean, it's a legitimate concern going back to when he was first diagnosed with the navicular injury, and I wrote a piece at the time looking at the history of it, and it's not just Bill Walton. It's multiple guys who have struggled with this injury. At the same time, it's kind of random. You can't tell just from looking at where we are right now, what's going to happen 5 years down the road. And there are guys who come back, have a setback and then come back and are ultimately healthy. So, it's the reason that I was concerned about drafting Embiid a year ago. I think that the fear is justified, but things aren't as bad as they look now, and they probably weren't as good. Probably weren't as far out of the woods as it looked a couple weeks ago before we knew that he had this setback.
Yeah, now he's in a situation where the CEO of the team, the coach, basically came out and said he was going to play in the summer league. You wonder what changed from them saying that to he could legitimately miss the entire season. To me, that seems like a really awkward timeline in the last month and a half.
And that's sometimes the case with medicine and with science. We want these answers to be easy, but they're the things that are complex and unpredictable.
Kevin, obviously, he is a big part of this team's plan. If for some reason he is unable to play, how much of a disaster would it be for this franchise?
I mean, it'd be tough to have spent an entire season, looking ahead to the draft and have that guy that you end up with out of the draft not provide you any value. But, I look at a team like Portland where as much as everyone laments the loss of Greg Oden and then Brandon Roy on top of that, for that matter, still they were able to get a LaMarcus Aldridge out of that period of rebuilding that they were going through, and then you pair him with a Damian Lillard, and all of a sudden they're back competing in the Western Conference. So, ultimately it is about those handful of star talents breaking through, and, if Nerlens Noel provides that, if this year's lottery pick provides that, then you can overcome having a couple of other guys miss with the volume of prospects.
That's a good point there, that obviously if you don't have them, you're probably going to be bad again, and you're going to get somebody else that will it will delay the process. There were some quotes in the paper here in Philly, Kevin, that basically suggested that Cleveland and Minnesota, or Milwaukee, who had the top 2 picks that year, would not consider him at all. Was that something that was pretty well known at the time of the draft? Do you look back and say Philadelphia should have known better, or do you not have a problem with them taking him at the number 3 pick last year?
Well, I think there's different appetites for risk for different teams. I mean, first off, Sam Hinkie, like Daryl Morey before him, has always shown a willingness to go out and make the big score, because the goal isn't to be better than average in their minds. It's to be the very best team, and to do that sometimes you have to take some risks, and knowing that those chances might come out wrong. The other aspect of it is, Cleveland and Milwaukee were teams that were thinking about competing now. The Cavaliers obviously very, very much doing so, still being in the NBA Finals, and Milwaukee getting back to the playoffs this season. They were thinking on a shorter timetable, I think, than the Sixers, where the possibility of Embiid missing his entire rookie season probably wasn't as big a deterrent to them.
You also have had people suggest that that he's not going to play at all this year, or at the very least he would miss the beginning of the season. We know the Sixers are very cautious with the way they handle things here. Would that, if you're in a front office, Kevin, would that change your view of this upcoming draft for the Sixers?
Probably not, because I think you're still looking more with an eye towards 2-3 years down the road than you are to this season. I think that's probably still the target, and I think maybe it makes you a little more willing to take a big man, even knowing that you might eventually have a crowd in the front court, because one possibility is it doesn't materialize if Embiid is unable to get on the court. But I think that's the only aspect where, that should only be a tiebreaker to me. Ultimately, at the number 3 pick, you're going with the best player available much more than you're going for need.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of people really think that Russell, if he's there at 3, would be the guy. There's a lot of reports coming out here that they really have their sights set on Porzingis, or that they could even go in a variety of ways. You never know what you can believe at this point right here. But for the guys in this draft, with what they have, Kevin, we're about 10 days out, who is the best fit for this roster?
Since day one, I've said Russell is the guy. I mean, I think that if you put him in a scenario where you put the ball in his hands and let him be the point guard and run the offense, he's eventually going to be a very successful player in this league. There is certainly a case to be made for Porzingis. He comes out actually number 2 in my WARP projections behind Russell, based on his performance the last couple of years in the Spanish ACB and some of the international competitions that his team has participated in. And then, I think the key is any of the top 5 this year, I think is going to be a good talent for you. Emmanuel Mudiay, certainly, there's a case to be made for him. What he did in his brief appearance in China, I think, generally backed up what the scouts like about him. And, Jahlil Okafor, I'm not as high on him as Towns, and probably is the consensus, but a great, unique prospect in his own right.
Yeah, you wonder if Towns gets somewhat knocked down a peg, because he is the most polished guy. Therefore, people think that his ceiling is the smallest to continue to grow. And it sounds like Sam Hinkie's the kind of guy that says, look, you might not be better than him now, but you have a much higher ceiling. And that's the guy, does Okafor get penalized almost for being more polished than everybody?
I think it's less about that and more probably about the questions about him at the defensive end of the floor. Although I still think my hunch is, when it comes down to it on draft night, that the Timberwolves will take Okafor.
Really? So you think that Okafor is still the guy? That would really be interesting, because then my follow-up question was really, if you're Sam Hinkie and you have all these assets, all these picks, the Lakers pick, the Miami pick, you have all these picks for down the road. Will they provide value for him on next Thursday night to be able to do something, maybe get another pick in the first round, or move himself up from 3 if the scenario you just mapped out happens?
There's certainly a lot of flexibility depending on what they want to try to do. I think, a lot of people have suggested getting back in the lottery with a second pick in the 8 to 10 range, and I think that would be difficult to do, because to the extent that I think teams are looking to trade out of the middle of the lottery this year, it's probably going to be to get a veteran player to accelerate their rebuilding their competing process, rather than delaying that pick for down the road. Utah maybe would consider that type of deal, but teams like Sacramento, Denver, with their new coach just hiring Michael Malone, Orlando, they all seem to want to try to win now, and Detroit can also fall into that group, adding Ersan Ilyasova, rather than wanting to wait for 2016.
Kevin, obviously the narrative on Sam Hinkie, a lot of people kind of snickering like, hey, we told you so, you should have known this. What do you, I don't know if you've talked to people or have knowledge of what people's thoughts are on what Sam Hinkie's doing. Is he a well-liked guy in the GM world out there? What are people's views of Sam Hinkie?
I wouldn't overstate how much I'm necessarily talking to GMs, but in general, I think it's as divided as it is among fans. I think that there are some people that that think they've gone too far in terms of aggressively rebuilding and not, using their cap space to sign players who can help them now and things like that. And then the some of the more aggressive strategic maneuvers, the claiming Thomas Robinson off waivers, things like that, aren't necessarily designed to win you friends within the league. But I think there are other people that look at Hinkie and think that they would do the same thing if they had the ability to do it with their ownership. And a lot of teams just don't have that choice. And so, Sixers ownership deserves credit for giving him the chance to let his plan play out as he views it.
If this Embiid thing doesn't work out, does that mean that Sam Hinkie has not worked out?
Yeah, I think I go back to the Portland point. Part of the reason that you acquire as many first-round picks as he has and, do this over a period of multiple years is that you're not tying your fortunes to one player. It's about, a portfolio of players, and if some of those turn out better than expected, it compensates even if some of them turn out worse than expected.
All right, Kevin Pelton, always good to catch up with him at K Pelton on Twitter. And, of course, the deadline to withdraw from the draft is today, so we'll see if any of the European players end up, or young international guys end up pulling out of the draft today. I would assume Porzingis not being one of those guys, but keep an eye on that as well. Your pick for the NBA Finals, do we see it end Tuesday night, or do we get a Game 7?
I think I lean slightly towards the Warriors finishing it off on Tuesday night, but I won't be surprised either way.
All right, Kevin, always appreciate the time, pal.
All right, thanks for having me back on.